The desert doesn't keep secrets. It buries them under a sky as wood and unforgiving as God's own judgment. Out here, the line between right and wrong is just a shadow dancing on the sand, and survival is a prayer whispered on a dry wind. This is the story of Jebediah Stone, a man running from his own ghosts who found a life he never expected in the cry of a dying child. It's a story of blood dust and a debt that could only be repaid in a storm of arrows and gunfire. What happens when an act of mercy grows into a legend that will echo across the plains? The sun was a merciless hammer on the anvil of the Sonoran desert. It beat down on the cracked earth, on the skeletal remains of saguaro cacti, and on the lone rider, Jebediah Stone. Jebediah was a man carved from the same hard materials as the landscape around him. His face was a road map of tough miles, and squinting into the glare, his eyes the color of a faded blue bandana. He rode not with the easy lope of a trail hand, but with the grim purpose of a man who preferred the company of slunts and shimmering heat waves. He was tracking a ghost, a mountain lion, that had been preying on the meager livestock of the few settlers brave or foolish enough to scratch a living from this unforgiving land. For 3 days, he'd seen nothing but tracks that vanished on sun-baked rock and the taunting flash of a lizard's tail. His canteen was dangerously light, and the silence was beginning to wear on him, a heavy blanket that smothered thought. It was then he heard it. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the yip of a coyote. It was a sound that had no place in this desolation, the thin, reedy wail of a human child. Jebediah pulled his buckskin Dusty to a halt. The horse flicked its ears, nervous. Jebediah scanned the horizon, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. This was Apache territory. A crying child could be bait. The Chiricahua were masters of ambush, and Jebediah, a former cavalry scout, knew their tactics better than most. He'd seen the brutal aftermath of their raids, and the memories were scars on his soul that pained him more than any physical wound. He dismounted his boots, sinking into the hot sand. He moved low and slow, rifle in hand, circling a large rock formation, from which the sound seemed to emanate. The wailing was weaker now, punctuated by desperate hitching breaths. He rounded the final boulder and froze. There in the sliver of shade was a scene of utter carnage. An overturned handcart, a few scattered belongings, a leather water skin, a woven blanket, a broken piece of pottery, and bodies. 2 adults, a man and a woman, their Apache dress telling Jebediah everything he needed to know. They were riddled with arrows, Apache arrows. The fletching was wrong. These were the cheap, clumsy arrows sold to bounty hunters or vigilantes. Beside them, sprawled in the dust, was a warrior, a single clean bullet hole in his chest. And huddled against his dead mother was the source of the sound. A boy no older than 4 or 5. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, his black hair matted to his forehead. He wore a simple breechcloth and was shaking not from cold, but from terror and grief. He looked up at Jebediah with eyes like chips of obsidian, ancient and bottomless, and let out a fresh sob that tore at the silence. Jebediah's heart, a thing he thought had long since turned to stone, clenched in his chest. He lowered his rifle. The ghosts of his past whispered to him the faces of women and children from a village along the Sand Creek, a battle that had been nothing short of a massacre, a memory that had driven him from the army and into this self-imposed exile. He saw the same terror in this boy's eyes that he'd seen in theirs. "Easy now, son," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. The boy flinched, scrambling back until he was pressed against the unmoving form of his father. He spoke in a tumble of Apache words, his small voice filled with a defiant fear. Jebediah didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. "Go away. Leave me. Monster." He holstered his Colt and slowly knelt, showing his empty hands. He unhooked his canteen from his belt. The slosh of the water was loud in the stillness. He unscrewed the cap and held it out. "Water," he said, pointing to his own mouth. "Agua." The boy stared, his chest heaving. His lips were cracked and swollen. The primal need for survival warred with his fear of this strange, pale-skinned giant. After a long moment, he crawled forward inch by agonizing inch. He snatched the canteen with a surprising swiftness, drank greedily, and then coughed as the water went down too fast. Jebediah stayed kneeling, patient. The boy drank again, more slowly this time, his dark eyes never leaving Jebediah's face. When he was done, he didn't return the canteen, but kept it clutched to his chest like a shield. Jebediah knew he had a choice. He could leave, ride away, and let nature take its course. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Bringing an Apache child into the town of Redemption Creek was like carrying a lit stick of dynamite into a powder magazine. But as he looked at the boy alone amidst the slaughter of his family, he saw a chance. Not just for the boy, but for himself. A chance to balance the scales of his own life, to atone for the ghosts that rode with him every day. "All right, kid." Jebediah sighed, the decision made. "Looks like you're with me." He gently wrapped the boy in his own saddle blanket. The child was stiff with resistance at first, but he was weak from dehydration and shock. He didn't fight as Jebediah lifted him. He was terrifyingly light. As Jebediah settled him in front of the saddle, the boy's head lolled against his chest, and he fell into an exhausted, fretful sleep. Before leaving the tragic scene, Jebediah took a moment. He couldn't give them a proper Apache burial, he didn't know the rites, but he couldn't leave them for the buzzards either. Using his hands and a flat piece of rock, he began the back-breaking work of covering the bodies with stones, creating 3 cairns under the blistering sun. It was a poor substitute for reverence, but it was all he could offer. An apology. A prayer. As he worked, he noticed something clutched in the dead woman's hand. He gently pried her fingers open. It was a small, carved wooden hawk, its wings outstretched, a child's toy. He tucked it into his saddlebag. The ride to Redemption Creek was a slow, deliberate affair. The boy who Jebediah had decided to call Cody, for the simple reason that it was a name, and he needed one, drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Jebediah trickled water between his lips and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him stories of the stars and the mountains. Words the boy couldn't understand, but whose gentle cadence seemed to calm him. Redemption. Creek was less a town and more a stubborn scar on the landscape. It consisted of a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the Red Dog Saloon. The law was a man named Sheriff Brody, a barrel-chested former soldier with a handlebar mustache and an unyielding certainty that the only good Apache was a dead one. When Jebediah rode down that street with an Apache child asleep on his saddle, the town went silent. Doors closed. Curtains twitched. Faces peered out of windows, their expressions a mixture of shock, fear, and outright hostility. He dismounted in front of his small, dilapidated cabin at the edge of town, a place he'd built with his own hands to keep the world at arm's length. As he lifted the boy down, the heavy thud of boots on the wooden boardwalk announced the arrival he'd been expecting. Stone Sheriff Brody's voice was a low growl. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Brody wasn't alone. A handful of townsmen had gathered behind him, their faces grim. Jebediah stood between them and the boy, who was now awake and hiding behind Jebediah's legs. "Evening, Sheriff. I'm taking this child into my home. That's not a child, Stone. That's a viper. You're bringing a snake into our town." Brody's hand rested on his gun belt. "His kin will come looking. They'll bring hell with them. His kin are dead." Jebediah said, his voice flat and cold. "Found them 3 days east of here. Murdered. Not by their own." A murmur went through the small crowd. Murder was one thing, an Apache feud was another. But this was different. "That ain't our concern," Brody insisted. "The army has forts for this sort of thing. He's their problem. By the time I got him to Fort Grant, he'd be dead," Jebediah countered. "He's staying with me. He's just a boy. He's Apache, a man named Peterson," the blacksmith spat. "They ain't like us. My brother was killed in a raid up near the Gila River. They don't feel things like we do." Jebediah's gaze hardened. He looked past Brody at the faces in the crowd, at the fear and hatred that was as much a part of this land as the dust. He felt grief just fine when I found him crying over his mother's body. He feels fear just fine standing here with all of you staring at him like he's a monster. Now I'm taking him inside. Anyone tries to stop me, they'll have to deal with me first." It was not an idle threat. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew Jebediah Stone kept to himself, but they also knew the stories. They knew he was fast with his Colt, and that he had a look in his eye that spoke of a past filled with violence. No one was eager to test him. Brody held his ground for a long moment, his jaw tight. He and Jebediah were two sides of the same coin, both veterans of the brutal frontier wars. But they had walked away with different lessons. Brody saw an eternal enemy. Jebediah saw a cycle of violence he refused to perpetuate. "This is on your head," Stone the Sheriff finally said, his voice laced with venom. "When the blood starts flowing, it's on you." He turned and stalked away, the crowd reluctantly dispersing behind him, muttering amongst themselves. Jebediah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned and gently guided the boy, Cody, into the dim, sparse cabin. He lit a lantern, casting a warm glow over the simple room. There was a cot, a small table, 2 chairs, and a cold stone fireplace. To the boy, it must have looked like a different world. Cody stood in the center of the room, a small, defiant figure in the flickering light. Jebediah offered him a piece of jerky, which he ignored. He set a bowl of water on the floor, and after a moment, the boy knelt and washed the dirt and tear tracks from his face. That night, Jebediah slept in his chair by the door, his rifle across his lap. Cody slept on the cot, curled into a tight ball, the saddle blanket clutched in his small fists. Every so often, he would cry out in his sleep, a series of sharp, guttural sounds from a nightmare Jebediah could only imagine. And each time, Jebediah would whisper into the darkness, "You're safe now, son. You're safe." He was making a promise not just to the boy, but to the ghosts of his past. Here in this dusty cabin on the edge of nowhere, Jebediah Stone's long, painful quest for redemption had just begun, and its fate was tied to the sleeping Apache child who had been born of the very people he once fought. The first year was a silent war fought across the small space of the cabin. Cody, as he was now known to the world, refused to speak. He was a ghost in Jebediah's home, moving with a quietness that was unnerving. He communicated with shakes of his head, with glares of defiance, or with an unnerving stillness. He would spend hours staring out the window at the distant mountains, his expression unreadable. Jebediah was patient. He talked to the boy constantly, narrating his day, explaining the tools of his trade, telling him stories he half remembered from his own childhood. He taught by doing. He showed Cody how to track deer instead of men, how to read the clouds for rain, how to whittle a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. The town of Redemption Creek remained a fortress of hostility. When Jebediah went for supplies, whispers followed him like flies. Children would taunt Cody from a distance, calling him savage and redskin. Cody would watch them with his dark, unblinking eyes, his small body rigid with a pride that seemed too large for his frame. Sheriff Brody made it a point to stop by Jebediah's cabin once a week. He'd stand on the porch, refusing to enter, and ask his questions. Any trouble? Seen any sign of his people? His inquiries were coated in a layer of suspicion, as if he expected to find Jebediah murdered in his sleep one morning. Jebediah's only ally was Clara Vance, the owner of the Red Dog Saloon. Clara was a woman who had seen the worst of men and had somehow managed to keep a core of compassion intact. She had arrived in Redemption Creek with a past she never spoke of and a small fortune that allowed her to buy the saloon outright. She was sharp-witty and possessed a gaze that could make even the toughest cowboy feel like an open book. She started leaving a small pail of fresh milk on Jebediah's porch every few days. The first time, Jebediah tried to pay her for it. "Don't be a fool, Jeb," she'd said. Leaning against the doorframe of the saloon, a cheroot held delicately between her fingers. "A growing boy needs milk. Consider it an investment in the town's future entertainment. Watching you and Sheriff Brody circle each other is the best show in town." One evening, nearly a year after Cody's arrival, Jebediah was cleaning his rifle by the fire. Cody was on the floor, meticulously arranging small pebbles into intricate patterns. Jebediah had just finished telling a rambling story about a stubborn mule he'd once known, and that mule he was so stubborn he'd rather starve than... Jebediah trailed off. From the floor, a small, quiet voice spoke a single word. "More." Jebediah froze. He looked down at the boy. Cody was staring at the fire, his face impassive, but his voice had been clear. It was the first English word he had ever spoken. A slow smile spread across Jebediah's face, cracking the dry landscape of his features. "More," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "All right, son. More it is." That single word was the key that unlocked the door. Cody began to speak first in hesitant single words, then in short, clipped sentences that mimicked Jebediah's own sparse way of talking. He learned English with a startling quickness, his mind a sponge for this new world. He also began to learn to read. Jebediah, who was barely literate himself, used the only book he owned, a worn copy of the Bible, to teach the boy his letters. As Cody grew, it became clear he possessed a dual nature. He had the sharp observational skills of an Apache warrior, able to spot a hawk on the wing from a mile away, or notice a single blade of grass bent in the wrong direction. But he also had a keen analytical mind that absorbed the white man's logic. He learned numbers from the prices at the general store and strategy from Jebediah's chessboard. He became Jebediah's shadow. He learned to ride, to shoot a rifle with an accuracy that was unnerving for a boy his age, and to care for the small patch of land Jebediah called a ranch. For the first time in a decade, Jebediah felt something akin to hope. The ghosts of Sand Creek still visited him in the dead of night, but now there was a new presence in his life that pushed them back. But the world outside their small cabin was not changing. The prejudice was a constant low-grade fever. The breaking point came when Cody was 10. He had gone into town to fetch some flour for Jebediah. A group of older boys, led by the blacksmith's son, cornered him in the alley beside the general store. "Looky here, it's the sheriff's pet savage," the blacksmith's boy, Billy Peterson, sneered. Cody stood his ground, the bag of flour held tight. "Leave me be, Billy. My pa says you people are killers and thieves, says you scalp women and children. Your pa is a fool." Cody said, his voice dangerously quiet. The insult was too much for Billy. He shoved Cody hard, sending him stumbling back. The flour sack broke, spilling its white contents all over the dusty ground. Something in Cody snapped. It was years of silent endurance, of taunts and glares, of being an outsider. He didn't fight like a town boy with clumsy, swinging fists. He moved like a desert cat. He was a blur of motion, ducking under Billy's wild punch and driving his shoulder into the bigger boy's stomach. Billy went down with a gasp. His friends, shocked, jumped in. Jebediah, alerted by the commotion, arrived to see Cody holding his own against 3 boys, his face a mask of cold fury, his movements fluid and economical. He was all sharp elbows and precise strikes. By the time Jebediah pulled him off, the other boys were whimpering on the ground, nursing bloody noses and bruised ribs. Sheriff Brody dragged them both to his office. Mr. Peterson was there, his face purple with rage. "Look what he did to my boy," Peterson roared, pointing at Billy's split lip. "He's a wild animal, Brody. I told you this would happen." He was defending himself. Jebediah set his hand on Cody's shoulder. They ganged up on him. Cody stated not a trace of fear in his voice. "They called my people killers. And what do you call this?" Brody demanded, gesturing at the battered boys. "This ain't how civilized folk settle disputes. There was nothing civilized about 3 boys cornering one Jebediah shot back. You've let this fester for years, Brody. You and your town. You've watered this hate, and now you're shocked it's borne fruit." The argument raged, but the outcome was preordained. To appease the town, Brody had to act. He couldn't lock up a child, but he could punish Jebediah. He was fined a hefty sum for disturbing the peace. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Cody was cleaning a small cut on his knuckle. "You shouldn't have fought," Jebediah said, his voice heavy. "I know why you did. But you can't win this way." "How should I win?" Cody asked, his eyes flashing. "By letting them spit on me, by letting them call my family murderers." "You found them, Jebediah. You know who the murderers were." "I know, son. But fighting them with your fists only proves their point in their minds. You have to be smarter. You have to be better." "I am not one of them," Cody said, a chasm opening between them in that moment. "And I am not one of you. So what am I?" It was a question. Jebediah couldn't answer. The years passed. Cody grew into a tall, lean young man. His face was a striking blend of his Apache heritage and the hard life of the frontier. He was quiet, thoughtful, but with a fire in his eyes that never went out. He and Jebediah had settled into a comfortable routine, a father and son forged not by blood, but by shared solitude and a stubborn refusal to be broken. The twist when it came was as sudden and violent as a summer thunderstorm. Cody was 17. He and Jebediah were mending a fence on the far edge of their property. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. They were not alone. They emerged from the rocks like spirits, 4 Apache warriors, their bodies painted for the trail. They were silent, materializing from the landscape as if they were born of it. At their lead was a warrior with a face like a hawk and eyes that burned with an old fire. He was older than the others, his body a tapestry of scars. Jebediah and Cody froze. Jebediah's hand moved towards his Colt, but the lead warrior raised a hand, a sign to halt. The warrior's eyes were fixed on Cody. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant in the Chiricahua dialect of the Apache language, a language Cody had not heard in 13 years, but that stirred something deep and primal within him. Jebediah didn't understand the words, but he saw the look on Cody's face. It was a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying recognition. "What's he saying, Cody?" Jebediah asked, his voice low. Cody's throat was dry. He translated his own voice, a whisper. He says he has been searching for a long time. He says he is Nachai. He was my father's brother. Nachai, his uncle. The name was a ghost from a life he barely remembered. Nachai took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over Cody's worn denim trousers and cotton shirt, his leather boots. There was a flicker of something disappointment, disgust. He spoke again, a longer stream of Apache. He says... Cody struggled to translate the words, feeling foreign and familiar at the same time. He says I was named Taza. My father was the chief Godja, the strong one. He says our band was attacked by white men seeking scalp bounties. He was away on a hunt. He returned to find everyone dead. He tracked the killers, but he also searched for me. For 13 years he has searched. Nachai's gaze shifted to Jebediah, and it was filled with a Yuled hard animosity. He spoke a single, guttural word. He blames you, Cody whispered, for turning me into one of them. I saved his life, Jebediah said, his voice tight. Nachai spat on the ground. He gestured at Cody, then at the mountains. It was a clear command. You are coming with us. Cody was torn. His whole life, his entire world was this small piece of land and the gruff, quiet man who had raised him. But the call of his blood, the truth of his identity, was a powerful, undeniable force. No, Jebediah said, stepping in front of Cody. He stays here. This is his home. Nachai's expression hardened. He barked an order, and his warriors fanned out their rifles now in their hands. Jebediah, don't, Cody pleaded, grabbing his arm. You can't fight them. He is Apache Nachai, said, speaking broken English for the first time, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. He is son of Godja. He is not yours. In that moment, Taza the boy, who was once Cody, made a choice. He looked at Jebediah, his eyes filled with a sorrow that was deeper than any ocean. I have to go, Jebediah. It is who I am. Cody, no. Jebediah's voice broke. My name is Taza. The young man said the name, feeling right on his tongue for the first time. He turned to his uncle. He spoke in Apache, the words rusty but firm. He was going. Nache nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He and his warriors began to move back, taking Taza with them. Jebediah stood helpless as the son he had raised, the boy he had saved, walked away from him. Taza looked back, once his face a mask of conflict and pain, before he disappeared into the twilight with the ghosts of his past. Jebediah Stone was alone again. The silence of the desert rushing back in, heavier and more profound than ever before. He had saved the boy from the desert, only to lose him back to it. His redemption felt like a cruel joke, a hollow echo in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The 5 years that followed were a crucible for two men, separated by a gulf of culture and land, yet bound by a shared past. For Jebediah Stone, the world shrank to the size of a whiskey bottle. The light went out of his cabin. The silence that had once been a comfort was now a torment, echoing with the ghost of a boy's voice, learning to read the memory of shared laughter over a poorly cooked meal. His small ranch fell into disrepair. Weeds choked his garden, and the fences Taza had helped him build began to sag. He was a man adrift. He sold his small herd of cattle to Clara Vance, who looked at him with worried eyes, but knew better than to offer pity. She took the cattle and paid him a fair price, pressing a few extra gold coins into his hand. For a rainy day, Jeb, she'd said softly. He'd taken the money and spent most of it at her saloon, sitting at a corner table nursing his drinks and staring into space. The townsfolk who had once viewed him with suspicion now saw him as a broken man, a cautionary tale. Sheriff Brody watched him with a kind of grim satisfaction, as if Jebediah's misery proved him right all along. But Jebediah was not entirely broken. Beneath the grief and whiskey, the old scout was stirring. After a year of mourning, he began to ride out. He became a man obsessed, tracking not animals, but rumors. He'd ride for weeks, visiting remote trading posts and lonely army forts, asking about a band of Chiricahua, led by a warrior named Nache, and a young man who might be with them. He learned snippets. He heard tales of a new cunning warrior among Nache's band. They called him the ghost who walks between worlds, because he seemed to understand the white man's ways, anticipating cavalry movements and outthinking his opponents. Jebediah knew with a certainty that was both proud and painful that this was Taza. He was alive, and he was becoming a leader. Jebediah never got close. Nache's band was elusive, a whisper on the wind. The trail always went cold, and Jebediah would return to Redemption Creek, older, wearier, and more alone than before. Meanwhile, for Taza, life was a brutal re-education. If he thought accepting his heritage would be a simple homecoming, he was wrong. To Nache and the other warriors, he was an outsider, tainted by the white world. He spoke their language with the accent of a stranger. His hands were soft from mending fences instead of skinning game, and his mind was filled with the enemy's logic. Nache was a harsh mentor. He drove Taza relentlessly, seeking to burn the Cody out of him. He was forced to relearn everything. How to move without a sound. How to survive for a week with only a knife and the clothes on his back. How to read the signs of the earth, not as a lesson, but as a language. He learned the songs of his people, the stories of their gods, the history of their long and bitter war against the Inda, the White Eyes. He was often mocked by the other young warriors. They called him Jebediah's boy and challenged him constantly, testing his strength and his spirit. His first few fights were clumsy, and he was beaten badly. But he learned. The lessons Jebediah had taught him, patience, observation, and strategy, began to merge with the Apache ways. He wasn't the strongest, but he was the smartest. He started to win, not with brute force, but by outthinking his opponents. His first true test came during a raid for horses against a group of prospectors. One of the warriors was shot and pinned down behind a rock. The others were ready to fall back to leave him, as was the hard custom when a raid went wrong. But Taza, remembering Jebediah's chess lessons about sacrificing a pawn to save a king, saw a different way. He used a small, controlled rock slide to create a diversion, drawing the prospector's fire while he circled around, silent as a shadow, and helped the wounded warrior escape. Nachai saw it all. That night by the fire, he looked at Taza with new eyes. The contempt was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. "You think like them," Nachai said in Apache. "This can be a weakness, or it can be a great weapon. My brother, your father, was strong, but you are sharp. A weapon must be sharp." From that day on, Taza was no longer an outcast. He was a warrior. He rose through the ranks his counsel sought by Nachai and the other elders. He led hunting parties that were always successful. He planned raids that were executed with a precision the cavalry couldn't counter. He knew how they thought, how they would react. He used their own tactics against them. But his heart was a battleground. At night, staring into the campfire, he would sometimes see Jebediah's face in the flames. He missed the quiet companionship, the gruff kindness of the man who had been his father in all but blood. He remembered learning to read by lantern light the taste of Clara's fresh milk, the weight of the Colt peacemaker in his hand. He was Apache, but a part of him would always be Cody the boy from Redemption Creek. This duality didn't make him weak, it made him wise. He understood both sides of a conflict that seemed to have no end. He knew the white men were not a monolith. There were the killers who had murdered his family, the prejudiced townsfolk like Brody and Peterson, but there was also Jebediah. When Nachai finally fell in a skirmish with Mexican soldiers south of the border, it was his dying wish that Taza should lead their people. Some of the older warriors grumbled, but the young ones whose lives he had saved and whose bellies he had kept full supported him. At the age of 22, Taza the boy Jebediah had found, crying in the desert, became the war chief of the remnants of the Chihena Chiricahua band. He was not a chief who sought war, but a leader forged in it, determined to find a future for his people in a world that wanted them erased. His first act as chief was to lead his people north away from the deserts of Mexico and back towards the familiar mountains and canyons of their ancestral lands in Arizona territory. It was a journey fraught with peril, a path that would lead him inevitably back towards the world he had left behind, and towards a confrontation that would test every part of his divided soul. News of Taza's return traveled faster than a prairie fire. It came in whispers from frightened prospectors, in urgent telegraphs between army forts, and in the panicked gossip of settlers. They spoke of a new Apache war chief, one who moved with the cunning of a ghost and fought with the ferocity of a demon. They said he was uniting the scattered Apache bands and that he was leading them on a warpath straight through the heart of the territory. In Redemption Creek, the fear was palpable. The town lay directly in the path of Taza's supposed advance. Sheriff Brody, his face grimmer than ever, organized a town militia, handing out old rifles to ranchers and storekeepers who were more accustomed to branding irons and cash drawers. "This is it," Brody announced to the anxious crowd gathered in the street. "It's Stone's viper come home to roost. He's bringing the devil with him." Jebediah heard the news and the talk, and a cold dread mixed with a strange, fierce pride filled him. He knew Taza. He knew the boy he had raised. Taza was not a butcher. There had to be more to the story. The larger story was a man named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a new kind of power in the West, not a cattle baron or a railroad man, but a speculator from back east with a portfolio of land grants and a team of ruthless lawyers. He had recently acquired the rights to the Black Springs Oasis, the only reliable source of water for 50 miles. His plan was simple and brutal. He was damming the spring. He would sell the water at exorbitant prices to the ranchers, and the town bleeding them dry until they were forced to sell their land to him for pennies on the dollar. What Blackwood hadn't counted on was that Black Springs was also a sacred site to Taza's people, a place they had used for generations. When Taza arrived and found Blackwood's men and machinery defiling the spring, he saw it not just as a threat to his people's survival, but as a profound sacrilege. The first attacks were not on settlers or the town. They were precise, targeted strikes. Taza's warriors swept down from the hills at night, destroying Blackwood's equipment, scattering his work crews, and vanishing before the sun rose. They were surgical, designed to halt the construction, not to start a massacre. But Blackwood was a master of manipulation. He sent riders to every settlement, including Redemption Creek, with fabricated stories. He claimed the Apaches had slaughtered his men in their sleep, that they had tortured his surveyors. He paid men to ride through town, shouting about an impending attack, fanning the flames of panic that Brody was all too eager to stoke. Blackwood's goal was to create enough chaos and fear that the U.S. cavalry would be called in. The army would crush the Apaches, solving his problem for good, and the terrified town would be even more dependent on him. It was Clara Vance who saw through the deception. One of Blackwood's hired guns, a man named Evans, got drunk in her saloon and boasted about how they were being paid to stir up the nest. "Blackwood don't care about this town," Evans had slurred. "He wants the land. All of it. He wants you all gone one way or another." Clara went straight to Jebediah. She found him in his cabin, cleaning the Colt peacemaker he hadn't seriously used in years. "Jeb, it's a setup," she said, quickly explaining what she'd heard. "Blackwood is using Taza, and he's using this town. He's pushing you all into a war so he can pick up the pieces." The pieces clicked into place for Jebediah. This wasn't a war of conquest by Taza. It was a defense of his land and water, the very same things Blackwood was trying to steal from the ranchers. They had a common enemy. "Brody won't listen to me," Jebediah said, his voice grim. "He sees what he wants to see." "Then you have to go around him," Clara urged. "You have to talk to Taza." The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. To see him again, not as the boy Cody, but as the war chief Taza. Could he even get close without being killed? "I have to try." "Jebediah," said his decision made. He took the small carved wooden hawk from a dusty shelf, the toy he'd taken from Taza's mother's hand all those years ago. It was a desperate token, a fragile bridge across a chasm of time and bloodshed. He rode out at dawn, heading not for the mountains where Taza's warriors were hiding, but for Black Springs. He knew Taza would be watching it. He rode slowly in the open, his rifle in its scabbard. It was a ride of pure faith. He was less than a mile from the half-built dam when they appeared. 4 warriors materializing from the rocks, their rifles trained on him. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard. Jebediah stopped Dusty and raised his hands slowly. "I am here to speak with Taza." he said, his voice steady. One of the warriors barked a laugh. The chief does not speak with white men. He will speak with me, Jebediah insisted. My name is Jebediah Stone. Tell him I am here. Show him this. He held up the small wooden hawk. The warriors looked at it, then at each other, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. One of them grunted, then turned and vanished back into the rocks. The other three remained their rifles, never wavering. Jebediah waited. The sun beat down. Every minute felt like an hour. He thought about the small boy he had carried out of the desert. He thought about the young man who had walked away from him into the twilight. He didn't know who would appear from those rocks. Then he saw him. Taza emerged, flanked by 2 guards. He was no longer the lean boy Jebediah remembered. He was a man broad-shouldered and commanding. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest bare, save for a simple necklace of bone and turquoise. A hawk feather was tied in his long black hair. His face was a hard, impassive mask. But his eyes, those were the same obsidian eyes, and in their depths, Jebediah saw a storm of conflicting emotions. Taza halted 20 paces away. Jebediah, he said. The name was a statement, not a greeting. His voice was deeper, imbued with an authority that sent a chill down Jebediah's spine. Taza Jebediah replied, his own voice thick. It's good to see you, son. The word son hung in the air between them. Taza's jaw tightened. I am not your son. Maybe not, Jebediah conceded, his heart aching. But you were. And I didn't raise a man who would lead a slaughter of innocents. The town is scared. They think you're coming to burn them to the ground. The town is full of fools who listen to the lies of a snake named Blackwood. Taza said, his voice cold. He poisons our sacred water. He tries to starve my people and your people. Is this not true? It's true, Jebediah admitted. But they don't see that. They only see Apaches on the warpath. Blackwood is playing you both. I do not need a white man to explain strategy to me. Taza snapped. I'm not here to explain it. Jebediah said, his voice rising with passion. I'm here to propose one. You and the people of Redemption Creek have the same enemy. Blackwood. His hired guns are holed up at that dam site. If you attack the town, the cavalry comes. Everyone loses but Blackwood. But if we fight together, we can crush the head of the snake. Taza stared at him, his face unreadable. The idea was insane. An alliance between Apache and the people who hated them. They would never agree, Taza said. Their sheriff would rather die than fight alongside my warriors. Leave the sheriff to me, Jebediah said. I need to know. Are you the man who wants revenge on everyone with white skin? Or are you the leader who will do what is necessary to save your people? The boy. I knew the one I taught chess to. He would see the move that wins the game. That struck home. Taza's impassive mask cracked for a fraction of a second. He remembered the chessboard, the lessons of looking ahead, of sacrificing a piece for position. My warriors will not be shot in the back by your ranchers, Taza said, his voice low and dangerous. And my people won't walk into an ambush, Jebediah countered. There has to be trust. He paused, then made his final desperate gambit. Let me stay here, a hostage, to guarantee the town's good faith. Send one of your men with my horse back to the town, as a sign of yours. This was unthinkable. An Apache warrior riding into Redemption Creek. a white man staying as a hostage. It was a move of such radical trust, such insane bravery, that it changed the calculation. Taza was silent for a long time, the wind whistling through the canyon. He looked at Jebediah, the man who had saved him, raised him, and then lost him. He saw not an enemy, but a man of honor, as stubborn and unyielding as the land itself. Finally, he nodded. "Go. Speak to your people," he commanded. He called over one of his warriors, a man named Dasoda. "Dasoda will ride with you. If he is harmed, Jebediah, you will die first. If your people betray us, we will burn them from the earth, and I will deliver your scalp to Blackwood myself." Jebediah returned to Redemption Creek with an Apache warrior at his side. The sight sent the town into a frenzy. Men grabbed their rifles. Brody and his militia met them at the edge of the street, guns raised. "Stone, have you lost your mind?" Brody roared. "Put the guns down." "Brody." Jebediah yelled, positioning himself between the militia and the stoic Dasoda. "I've come from Taza's camp. He's not our enemy. Blackwood he's playing us all for fools." He laid it all out, his words tumbling over each other in his urgency. He told them about Blackwood's plan, about the water, about the lies. He told them of Taza's offer, a joint attack on Blackwood's men at the dam. "You want us to fight alongside them?" "Peterson," the blacksmith shouted, his face pale. "The savages who murdered my brother, the men who murdered Taza's family, were white scalp hunters." Jebediah shot back, his voice cracking like a whip. "There's enough blood on everyone's hands. Are you going to keep the cycle going until we're all dead, and Blackwood owns the ashes, or are you going to fight for your homes?" The townsmen were wavering, caught between their deep-seated hatred and the terrifying logic of Jebediah's words. It was Sheriff Brody who was the real obstacle. "I will never trust an Apache," Brody said, his rifle steady. "You don't have to trust them," Jebediah said, his voice dropping. "Trust me, I left a part of my soul with that boy, and I left my life in his hands as collateral. He will keep his word. The question is, will you?" The standoff was broken by Clara, who emerged from the saloon carrying a shotgun. She walked to Jebediah's side. "Jeb is right," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm with him." One by one, a few other ranchers' men who stood to lose everything to Blackwood's dam lowered to their rifles. They were terrified, but they were not stupid. They chose survival over prejudice. Seeing his support crumbling and faced with the united front of Jebediah and Clara Brody, finally reluctantly lowered his own gun. "All right, Stone," he growled. "But if this is a trick, I'll kill you myself." The plan was set. Under the cover of darkness, half of the town militia, led by Jebediah and a still skeptical Brody, rode towards the dam. They moved into position on the south ridge overlooking Blackwood's camp. On the north ridge, Taza and 50 of his warriors melted into the shadows. The signal was the cry of a lone coyote, a sound Jebediah and Taza had used to call to each other when they were hunting as a boy and his father. When Jebediah made the call, the night exploded. Arrows rained down from the north, silent and deadly, picking off Blackwood's sentries. Then the militia on the south ridge opened up with a volley of rifle fire. Pinned between the two forces, Blackwood's hired guns were thrown into chaos. The battle was short and brutal. Taza led his warriors in a charge down the slope, a wave of disciplined fury. The townsmen, seeing the Apaches fighting not against them, but for them, found a new courage and pressed their own attack. Jebediah and Brody fought side by side, a strange and unlikely pairing. In the end, Blackwood's forces were broken. The few who survived fled into the desert. Silas Blackwood himself, who had been overseeing the work, was captured by Tazza. As the sun began to rise over the now silent battlefield, the two groups of fighters stood apart, watching each other warily across the contested ground. The air was thick with smoke blood and a new, fragile understanding. Tazza dragged Blackwood before Jebediah and Brody. "This is the man who killed my mother and father," Tazza said, his voice filled with a cold, contained rage. It wasn't a guess. One of the captured gunmen had confessed everything, describing the raid for scalp bounties 13 years earlier, a raid funded by a young, ambitious land speculator named Silas Blackwood. Apache law demands his life. Brody looked at the terrified, pleading Blackwood, then at Tazza, and finally at Jebediah. The world was no longer black and white. "He's yours," Brody said, turning his back. Tazza took Blackwood into the rocks. There was a single piercing scream, and then silence. Justice, brutal and final, had been served. As his warriors began to fade back into the mountains, Tazza approached Jebediah for the last time. The space between them was no longer a battlefield, but it was not the easy space of a father and son either. It was a space of mutual hard-won respect. "You were right, Jebediah," Tazza said quietly. "You taught me to see the whole board. You became the leader your people needed," Jebediah said, his heart full. "Your father would be proud." Tazza reached out and clasped Jebediah's forearm, the warrior's grip. "Live well, Jebediah Stone. You too, Tazza, you too." Jebediah watched as Tazza mounted his horse and led his people away, not in retreat, but towards a new future. They were heading north to a reservation the government had promised, a place where they might find peace. It was an uncertain future, but it was a future Tazza had secured for them. Jebediah Stone returned to Redemption Creek, not as an outcast, but as a hero. He had faced down his own ghosts, and in doing so had saved the town from itself. He didn't return to his lonely cabin. He walked into the Red Dog Saloon, where Clara was waiting. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, the lines of pain on his face softened into a genuine smile. His redemption wasn't in a grand final battle, but in the quiet promise of a new beginning. He had found his peace not in solitude, but in connection to the town he had saved, to the woman who had stood by him, and to the memory of the Apache child who had returned as a king. In the heart of the unforgiving West, the story of Jebediah Stone and Tazza reminds us that lines drawn in the sand between cultures, between enemies, between past and future, can be washed away by the tides of honor and courage. Theirs is a testament to the fact that redemption isn't always about forgetting the ghosts of the past, but about learning to live with them. And that true leadership is found not in vengeance, but in the wisdom to build a better future. A single act of mercy echoed through the years, changing the fate of a man, a town, and a tribe. If this story of an unlikely bond forged in the crucible of the frontier moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of real-life drama and hardship. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more forgotten stories from the dusty pages of the Old West. Let us know in the comments what part of their journey resonated with you the most. Thanks for listening.